Her scream shattered the heavy silence inside the saloon. It wasn't loud, just sharp enough to make every man pause mid-drink and glance up. Evelyn Grace knelt on the rough, dusty floorboards, wrists bound tight with rope. Blood mixed with dirt across her skin, and her torn shirt hung loosely from her shoulders, barely covering her trembling frame. Every mark on her body told its own story. Dark bruises like plums on her hips, dried blood crusted on her knees, and a fresh cut trickling down her temple. She looked no older than 19, yet her eyes carried the weight of a lifetime lived in fear. The men around her watched like hungry wolves, the air thick with whiskey, sweat, and something darker, desire. From behind a table, the owner of the Silver Spur Saloon, Silas Crowder, grinned wide and slammed his palm down. $30 to start, he barked, his voice echoing through the smoky room. This one's pure, untouched, fresh as spring rain. The crowd erupted in laughter. Coins clattered. 40, someone shouted. 50, another hollered. Evelyn flinched, trying to pull the torn fabric across her chest, but the rope only dug deeper into her wrists. Her breath came in shaky gasps. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Crowder strolled behind her, his hand brushing the back of her neck. "Don't look so scared, girl," he murmured close to her ear. "You'll make some man real happy tonight." The room howled with cruel amusement. To them, this wasn't brutality, it was entertainment. Evelyn bit her lip until blood streaked down her chin. Her eyes darted through the crowd, searching desperately for a single kind face. But there was none. Only men staring at her like she was property, something to buy. Then, cutting through the laughter and chaos, came a new voice. Low, gravelly, steady. 75. The room went dead silent. Every head turned toward the saloon doors. A tall man stood there. Sunburned skin, dust on his boots, and a calm stillness that didn't belong in a place like this. His name was Jonas Whitaker, a rancher from 10 miles out, known for living alone ever since his wife had been taken from him years ago. He'd just sold off a herd of cattle last week. More money than he'd held in years. Enough to rebuild his ranch, or maybe to make peace with a ghost that had followed him since the night bandits destroyed his family. Crowder squinted at him. 75? You sure about that, old man? Jonas gave a single nod. Cash! The crowd exploded. Laughter, disbelief, and shock tangled in the smoky air. But no one outbid him. Crowder grinned wide, snatching the bills. She's all yours. Jonas stepped forward, slow and steady. He knelt beside Evelyn and loosened the ropes himself. Then wordlessly, he took off his coat and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. For a fleeting second, her eyes met his, and in them was something fragile. Something she hadn't felt in so long. Trust. Outside, the Kansas wind swept dust down the empty street. Evelyn stumbled beside him, half dazed, half convinced this was just another cruel trick. And maybe it was, because in Millfield nothing good ever came without a price, but still, the question lingered in every whispering gust of wind. Why would a lonely old rancher spend every dollar he had to buy a broken girl he'd never met? The road out of town was quiet. Too quiet. The wind carried nothing but the creak of saddle leather and the crunch of hooves on dry earth. Evelyn rode behind Jonas, her arms barely brushing his back, her eyes fixed on the horizon, afraid to look at him, afraid to wonder what waited at the end of this ride. After a few miles, Jonas slowed near a line of old oak trees standing over the ridge, their shadows stretching across the cracked ground. Time to rest, he said simply. He climbed down, untied a canteen, and took out a tin cup. Evelyn hesitated, then slid off the horse, her bare feet pressing into the hot dirt. Jonas poured water into the cup and held it out. Drink. Her lips were cracked, her throat dry as dust. She took a sip, but her wary eyes never left his face. Then suddenly, she hurled the cup at him. Water splashed across his shirt. Jonas stepped back, startled, as Evelyn spun and bolted toward the brush, stumbling with every step. Hey, he called out, not angry, just firm. You run out there, you won't last a mile in this heat. She turned, shaking, eyes blazing. You think I'm stupid? You paid for me. You think I don't know what comes next? Her voice cracked mid-sentence. Jonas sighed, rubbing the water from his face. His tone dropped low, calm. I ain't like those men in that saloon, girl. You don't have to run from me. For a long moment, she just stared at him, sweat and tears streaking down her dusty face. Jonas pointed toward the canteen lying in the dirt. Suit yourself. But you'll need that more than I do. He tossed it toward her feet, turned, and began walking back to the horse, leaving the choice entirely hers. Evelyn stood frozen under the burning sun, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it echo in her ears. The heat pressed against her skin like a weight she couldn't shake. After a long pause, she turned, walked back slowly, and picked up the canteen from the dirt. Without a word, she followed Jonas, keeping several paces behind. Even as her feet moved, her thoughts twisted in fear and suspicion. Men like him always wanted something. There was always a price. She'd stay alert, keep her distance, and wait for the first hint of betrayal. She didn't say thank you, but the way she clutched the canteen to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her alive, said more than words could. By the time they reached his ranch, the sun was sinking behind the distant ridge, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. The small wooden house stood lonely and quiet, weathered by time but still standing proud against the endless prairie. Jonas helped her down from the horse, careful, steady, gentle. "Sit there," he said softly. "I'll get you some water." Evelyn sat on the porch steps, aching all over, watching him move across the yard like a man long used to silence. A few minutes later, he returned with a tin cup and a folded shirt. "Put this on," he said, handing it to her. "You look like you've been through hell." She took the shirt without meeting his eyes and walked behind the barn to change. Every few seconds, she peeked out, making sure he wasn't watching. Trust didn't come easy, not after what she'd been through. When she finally returned, her voice trembled. "You paid for me, so go on." "Do it," Jonas froze, eyes narrowing just slightly. "No," he said, his tone low and steady. "I didn't buy you. I bought your freedom." The words hung in the air, carried by the desert wind as the last light of day slipped behind the horizon. Evelyn stared at him, unable to speak, unsure whether to believe him. And for the first time in a long time, something fragile stirred inside her. A quiet question. What if not all men were the same? The next morning came soft and golden, the kind of morning that almost made the world look kind. Jonas was out mending the fence while Evelyn tried to help, though her hands trembled when she lifted the hammer. She'd slept in a bed for the first time in months, eaten until she couldn't anymore. But peace felt strange, like wearing someone else's coat. It didn't fit quite right. Jonas glanced at her now and then, but didn't speak much. He wasn't a man of many words, yet every word he did say seemed to matter. "You keep working," he said, a faint smile beneath his mustache. "You'll earn that breakfast." Evelyn smiled back, a real smile this time, the first he'd seen from her. By afternoon, the heat settled thick over the land. Cicadas screamed from the trees and the air shimmered above the dry grass. Jonas filled the water trough while Evelyn gathered wood for the stove. For a few quiet hours, it almost felt normal, like maybe the world had paused. But peace never lingered long in the West. Back in town, Clayton Boone sat hunched in the Silver Spur saloon, his pride bleeding worse than his wallet. The men around him laughed loud and long about the old rancher who'd outbid him, the one who'd walked out with the girl. And as the laughter grew, so did the hatred in Clayton's eyes. Clayton Boone's glass slammed hard against the bar, spilling whiskey across the wood. "That bastard took what's mine," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. His two hired guns exchanged glances and nodded. Clayton rose from his chair, shoving it back with a scrape. "Mount up," he ordered. "We're paying him a visit before sunset." Out at the ranch, Jonas Whitaker felt it before he saw it. The air growing still, the kind of silence that meant trouble was coming. His horse twitched, ears pointed toward the horizon. Inside, Evelyn was washing dishes, softly humming a tune so faint it barely drifted through the doorway. Jonas stepped onto the porch, his gaze sweeping across the open land. A thin column of dust curled up against the orange sky. Riders. He picked up his old rifle, steady and calm, the way a man gets when he's faced death before. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, sensing the change in his face. "What is it?" she asked. "Are they coming?" Jonas nodded once, eyes still on the ridge. "Stay inside. Lock the door. Don't open it unless you hear my voice." She wanted to argue, but the quiet authority in his tone stopped her cold. The sound of hooves grew louder, 3 shadows riding hard through the dying light. Clayton Boone had found them. He dismounted, boots crunching against dry dirt. "Evening, old man," he called out with a sneer. Figured we had some unfinished business. Jonas stood tall, rifle loose in his hands, his face unreadable. The air between them felt sharp enough to cut. Inside, Evelyn pressed her back to the wall, heart racing. She'd been owned, beaten, sold, wound, and saved. But maybe freedom wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was the start of her test. The air was still, too still. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. Jonas stood near the fence, rifle in hand. Across the yard, Clayton smirked under the brim of his hat, the smirk of a man convinced he'd already won. Behind him, his two riders waited, hands hovering over their guns. "Evening, Whitaker," Clayton called out. "You got something that belongs to me?" Jonas's voice was calm, steady. "Don't reckon I do." Clayton stepped closer, his spurs jingling with each step. "You think buying her makes you a hero?" "You ain't no hero, just an old fool with money to burn." He spat in the dirt. "Now hand her over before someone gets hurt." Inside, Evelyn peeked through the curtain, her pulse pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. She wanted to run. She'd always run. But something deep inside her refused to this time. Jonas lifted his rifle slightly. "She ain't yours," he said. "And she sure as hell ain't mine. She's her own person. Best ride back before you make a mistake you can't take back." Clayton's grin faltered. "That girl owes me," he snapped. "She looked me dead in the eye when they called my name." Jonas shook his head. "She don't owe you a damn thing." The air cracked like thunder. One of Clayton's men twitched. His hand went for his gun. Jonas fired first. The rifle roared, echoing off the hills. The bullet grazed the man's shoulder, tearing his coat and knocking his hat clean off. He stumbled back, gun clattering to the ground. Clayton's grin twisted into fury. He yanked his revolver free and fired. Jonas dropped behind the water trough as the bullet splintered the wood inches from his head. Evelyn screamed, ducking behind the doorframe. "Stay down!" Jonas shouted as he reloaded. He fired again. The second shot ripped through Clayton's sleeve, shredding the fabric. The two hired hands broke. One spun his horse and bolted into the dust. The other froze, too scared to move. Clayton cursed through his teeth. "You just made a big mistake, old man. You can't shoot your way out of this." Jonas rose slowly, calm as stone. "Maybe not," he said. "But I can sure as hell try." For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then, Evelyn did something no one saw coming. She stepped out onto the porch, her hands shaking but steady. Jonas's revolver clutched tight in her grip. Her voice trembled, but her hand stayed firm. "Leave us alone," she said. "You had your chance." Clayton's eyes widened. He wasn't used to being the one who felt fear. For a moment he hesitated, then took one slow, tense step back. His jaw tightened. "This ain't over," he hissed. He swung onto his horse, spurred it hard, and vanished into the dusk, a trail of dust rising behind him like smoke from a dying fire. Jonas didn't lower his guard. He knew better. The sheriff would come asking questions soon, about the gunshots, about blood spilled on open land. And men like Clayton Boone didn't forget a grudge. They waited, rebuilt, and came back stronger. Evelyn finally lowered the gun, her arms shaking uncontrollably. The wounded hired hand groaned in the dirt, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Alive, but hurt bad enough to need a doctor. Jonas walked over, grabbed him by the collar, and hauled him toward his horse. "Tell your boss," he said coldly. "This ends here. Next time it won't." The man nodded weakly and rode off, disappearing into the night. Jonas turned back toward Evelyn. For a moment their eyes met, a mix of pride, fear, and something neither could name. "He'll come back, won't he?" she asked quietly. Jonas glanced toward the road where the sky still burned orange above the hills. "Oh, he'll come back," he said softly. "The question is when." Night settled calm and heavy after the storm. The air still smelled of gunpowder and dust. Jonas fixed the broken fence post while Evelyn gathered the spent shells from the porch. Neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward, just necessary. Sometimes silence was the only way two people could breathe again. Stars blinked awake one by one, filling the sky with quiet light. Jonas sat on the porch steps, his sleeve bandaged where a bullet had grazed him. Evelyn brought him a cup of coffee, her hand still trembling. He took it and nodded his thanks. "You did good out there," he said quietly. She looked down. "I was scared." Only fools ain't, he replied, the hint of a smile in his voice. After a moment, he added, fear's what reminds you you're still alive. Evelyn sat beside him. The night air smelled of pine and cool dirt. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel small, didn't feel owned. She felt strong. A lone coyote howled somewhere in the distance. Jonas chuckled. Guess word's out, we made it through another day. Evelyn smiled, quiet but real. Then she turned to him and asked, you could have let me go that first night. Why didn't you? Jonas stared out toward the moonlit hills. Maybe I saw someone worth saving, he said. Or maybe I just didn't want to die knowing I never did the right thing when I had the chance. The wind rolled across the plains, cooler now, softer. Evelyn reached out and touched his hand, a small, simple gesture. But in that touch lived something unspoken. Not pity, not debt. Something steadier, stronger. Something that, given time, could grow into love. Weeks turned into months. The land healed, and so did they. It wasn't easy. There were nights when Evelyn woke screaming from nightmares, and mornings when Jonas sat quiet at the fence line, haunted by memories of his wife. But little by little, through shared work and quiet talks beneath the porch lantern, they built something that felt real. Evelyn helped rebuild the ranch. Jonas learned to laugh again. He never called her a burden, never called her a debt. He called her hope. And that made all the difference. Life in the West was cruel. But sometimes, it offered second chances to those brave enough to take them. And maybe that's the lesson we forget too often. Courage isn't just drawing a gun. It's getting back up every time the world knocks you down. It's choosing kindness when anger would be easier. Now let me ask you something. If you were Jonas, would you have risked everything to protect a stranger? Or would you have walked away to save yourself? Think about it for a moment. And if this story touched you, even a little, give it a like. It helps more folks find stories like this one. If you love tales of courage, redemption, and the untamed Wild West, then pull up a chair, pour yourself some coffee, and hit that subscribe button. Because out here, in the quiet corners of the world, stories like this still matter. And maybe, just maybe, they remind us who we're meant to be.